Alexander's encounter with the Jews. Alexander took over his father's leadership position when he was yet a teenager. He would be dead by the time he was 29. In that short period, he conquered the entire civilized world. One of his campaigns brought him to the land of Israel. He arrived during the reign of the great high priest, the last of the men of the great assembly, Simon the Just. Most historians say that he came in about the year 329 BCE. He was dead by 323 BCE. The Jews were terrified of the now victorious Greeks because they had backed Persia in the war. There were two choices. We will see this story repeated over and over again in the time of the Second Temple. One was to fight, which is what the Jews did later with the Romans. The second was to somehow come to an accommodation with the enemy. Simon the Just chose the second course. The Jews were not about to defeat Alexander in battle. Therefore, the correct way to deal with the matter was to come to an accommodation with him. The Talmud describes the drama of that first encounter, Yoma 69a. Simon the Just came forth with other members of the priesthood, as well as the sages of the Sanhedrin, to greet Alexander at the gates of Jerusalem as he strode in on his famous white horse, which he rode all over the world in his conquests. According to the historians of the time, it was an enormously tall horse and Alexander was an enormously tall person. Plus, he always wore a plumed helmet. Combined, Alexander stood about 13 feet high on the horse. He was an awe-inspiring sight to behold. When Alexander saw the Simon, he dismounted and bowed to him. When he was questioned by his advisors, he told them that whenever he went into battle, he dreamed of an angel leading him to victory. The face of the Jewish high priest, he said, was the face of the angel he saw in his dreams. That was why he bowed down to him.
I think one of the great, remarkable parts of history is when Alexander the Great visited Jerusalem. Now, whether you accept the accounts of Josephus or not, that's up to you. Many scholars do not. In fact, most don't. But there's other people, if you'll read up on it, come from other angles, and there has to be some validity to the fact of what Josephus says in some places, because I think, Alexander the Great did spare Jerusalem. And at the very least, I think we have him making a sacrifice to the God of Israel. That has more validity than some of the other things that the scholars have some problems with, but still, some people put great validity to the account of Josephus, and that is what we have here. Whatever you want to say, divine providence in one way or the other truly did cause Alexander the Great, who was trained by Aristotle, to spare Jerusalem.
The 7 months of the siege of Tyre were over, and the 2 months of the siege of Gaza, Sanballat died. Now Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, made haste to go up to Jerusalem. And Jadis the high priest, when he heard that, was in an agony and under terror, as not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians, since the king was displeased at his foregoing disobedience. He therefore ordained that the people should make supplications, and should join with him in offering sacrifice to God, whom he besought to protect that nation, and to deliver them from the perils that were coming upon them. Whereupon God warned him in a dream, which came upon him after he had offered sacrifice, that he should take courage and adorn the city and open the gates, that the rest should appear in white garments, but that he and the priests should meet the king in the habits proper to their order, without the dread of any ill consequences, which the providence of God would prevent. Upon which, when he rose from his sleep, he greatly rejoiced, and declared to all the warning he had received from God. According to which dream he acted entirely, and so waited for the coming of the king. And when Jadis understood that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession, with the priests and the multitude of the citizens. The procession was venerable, and the manner of it different from that of other nations. It reached to a place called Sapha, which name, translated into Greek, signifies a prospect, for you have thence a prospect both of Jerusalem and of the temple. And when the Phoenicians and the Samaritans that followed him thought they should have liberty to plunder the city and torment the high priest to death, which the king's displeasure fairly promised them, the very reverse of it happened. When he saw the multitude at a distance, in white garments, while the priests stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the golden plate whereon the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself, and adored that name, and first saluted the high priest. The Jews also did all together, with one voice, salute Alexander, and encompass him about. Whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, and supposed him disordered in his mind. However, Parmenion alone went up to him, and asked him how it came to pass that, when all others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews? To whom he replied, I did not adore him, but that God who has honored him with his high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, when I was at Dion in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army, and would give me the dominion over the Persians. Whence it is that, having seen no other in that habit, and now seeing this person in it, and remembering that vision, and the exhortation which I had in my dream, I believe that I bring this army under the divine conduct, and shall therewith conquer Darius, and destroy the power of the Persians, and that all things will succeed according to what is in my own mind. And when he had said this to Parmenion, and had given the high priest his right hand, the priests ran along by him, and he came into the city. And when he went up into the temple, he offered sacrifice to God, according to the high priest's direction, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priests. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. As he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. But the next day he called them to him, and bid them ask what favors they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers, and might pay no tribute on the 7th year. Note, he granted all they desired. And when they asked him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, he willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And when he said to the multitude that if any of them would enlist themselves in his army, on this condition, that they should continue under the laws of their forefathers, and live according to them, he was willing to take them with him. Many were ready to accompany him in his wars. The story of Alexander the Great and the Jews is intimately intertwined. However, its after effects shook the Jewish world to its roots. The book of Daniel 7 verses 3 to 7, begins with a frightening vision. 4 beasts, one more frightening than the other, emerge from the sea. According to Jewish tradition, Midrash, Leviticus Rabbah 13:5, each beast represents one of the 4 major empires that would exile the Jews: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. We tend to think of Greece as a nation of poets and philosophers, which they were. However, they were also an empire, a terrifying predatory beast, and embodied all the traits that empires embody: violence, oppression, and terror. For the longest time in world history, Greece was a sideshow, a small, divided country at the extreme western end of the known world. They were a seemingly insignificant player in global events that saw the Babylonians and Persians rise and become masters of the world. How did Greece come to take center stage and supplant major, world-crushing empires? The first thing to know about Greece is that, romantic as it sounds, it is a difficult land to tame. Great rivers and impassable mountains dominate its topography. Thus, for centuries the communities of Greece were disparate and antagonistic toward each other. The Persians also made a great mistake. because they were now in a place people came to resent them. The resulting hatred toward the Persians created a common enemy and thereby laid the groundwork for a great leader to step in and do what no one before him was able to do: unite the powerful and industrious Greek peoples. At the beginning of the 4th century BCE, in about the year 370 BCE, a king arose in Macedonia known as Philip of Macedon. Macedonia is in the northwest corner of Greece. It is basically a Balkan country, and the Macedonians were part of the general Greek nation. However, they were looked down upon and despised by the Athenians and Spartans because they were boorish and uncultured. Philip was a great warrior and organizer. Most of all, he had the dream of empire in him. In 7 years, he was able to subdue all the Greek city-states and unite them, something that had not happened in almost 5 centuries. Of course, he united them at the point of the sword, but he united them. He even threw the Persians out of Greece. However, his dream of empire included taking Persia away from the Persians. It was an audacious thought. Persia ruled the world. However, Philip took his battle-tested army into Asia Minor, near what is today Constantinople, and in one of the classic battles of history defeated the Persian army. Unbelievably, the Persian Empire fell apart. As he turned to conquer the rest of the world, he died, which often happens. Just when someone thinks he has it made, it turns out that he made the reckoning without taking God into consideration. Alexander the Great. Philip died but left a son, who would become one of the single greatest forces in history, Alexander the Great. He called himself that modestly, but the truth is that he was great. Philip did not want Alexander to grow up to be a coarse and boorish Macedonian, so he gave him a tutor, the renowned philosopher Aristotle. It was Aristotle who implanted in Alexander the philosophic ideals of the Greeks. Alexander was not a pagan because Aristotle was not a pagan. Aristotle's concept of God was that a creator exists. The Greek philosophers referred to God as the first cause. He pushed the button, so to speak. However, once he did so, he did not do anything more. What happened on earth did not interest him. Therefore, there was no interference from heaven as to what happened on earth. It was another way of unburdening themselves of conscience, except now with the stamp of belief in God. Nevertheless, the Greeks believed that God existed, which is very important because it will help explain one reason why Alexander was able to tolerate the Jewish religion, whereas many of the Persian emperors were not. Aristotle knew that all the stories of the gods, from Apollo to Zeus, were made up. Alexander, as Aristotle's student, also believed that, thanks to Aristotle, therefore, the ideas of the Jews were much more acceptable to Alexander. Alexander's encounter with the Jews. Alexander took over his father's leadership position when he was yet a teenager. He would be dead by the time he was 29. In that short period, he conquered the entire civilized world. One of his campaigns brought him to the land of Israel. He arrived during the reign of the great high priest, the last of the men of the great assembly, Simon the Just. Most historians say that he came in about the year 329 BCE. He was dead by 323 BCE. The Jews were terrified of the now victorious Greeks because they had backed Persia in the war. There were two choices. We will see this story repeated over and over again in the time of the Second Temple. One was to fight, which is what the Jews did later with the Romans. The second was to somehow come to an accommodation with the enemy. Simon the Just chose the second course. The Jews were not about to defeat Alexander in battle. Therefore, the correct way to deal with the matter was to come to an accommodation with him. The Talmud describes the drama of that first encounter, Yoma 69a. Simon the Just came forth with other members of the priesthood, as well as the sages of the Sanhedrin, to greet Alexander at the gates of Jerusalem as he strode in on his famous white horse, which he rode all over the world in his conquests. According to the historians of the time, it was an enormously tall horse and Alexander was an enormously tall person. Plus, he always wore a plumed helmet. Combined, Alexander stood about 13 feet high on the horse. He was an awe-inspiring sight to behold. When Alexander saw the Simon, he dismounted and bowed to him. When he was questioned by his advisors, he told them that whenever he went into battle, he dreamed of an angel leading him to victory. The face of the Jewish high priest, he said, was the face of the angel he saw in his dreams. That was why he bowed down to him. Because of Aristotle, Alexander was positively disposed toward the Jews. Instead of destroying and subjugating them, he made an arrangement with them. As long as they would be his loyal vassals and pay their taxes, they could remain autonomous. That was an enormous concession because Alexander was rarely that accommodating to anyone. Out of gratitude to Alexander, the Jews did a few things. First, they agreed to name every child born the next year Alexander. That is why the name Alexander, or Sender for short, became a common Jewish name even to this day. At the same time, it also opened the door for Jews to give their children other Greek names such as Antigonus Tarpon, among other names of Greek origin one finds in the Talmud. Ironically, through showing Alexander their gratitude, by naming their children after him, they unwittingly opened the door to the Greek language. And with the Greek language automatically came the Greek culture. The Jews also agreed to install a system of tax collection that would lead to terrible corruption. Indeed, it was so inherently corrupt that the Talmud held that anybody who was a tax collector was presumed to be a thief. This terribly pernicious system destroyed the morale of the Jewish community in the time of the Greeks long after Alexander was gone.